Okay, continuing on with our ladder, pole, and diving board system. We just keep calling it the ladder, but I mean, it's really more than just a ladder. We could call it the diving board.
I guess this just comes from Project Dev. I just called it a ladder and it stuck.
It just stuck, and I just, accepted it. Yeah, it's a ladder. But that is what we're going to create in this video. We're going to put the ladder portion onto this guy. So let's go ahead and jump back over to the whiteboard and talk about how we're going to do this real quick. We're going to start out by creating a brand new line that is going to have the exact same height as the first line plus 1 unit. Because we want our 2 ladder poles, our left and right poles that all the rungs are going to be connected to go slightly above the height of our diving board. So we'll have a new line, and then we're going to position that line. So because of perspective drawing, this is going to be kind of hard to see. But starting right here, boom, there we go. That's a new line. No, that's horrible. And better, looking good. Did you like it, Steve? You like it?
It's pretty straight.
There you go. It works. All right, so we have this new line. Then Steve is going to create a circle. And while the circle is not going to come in located right here, I'm just going to draw it there just for visualization purposes here on the whiteboard. And then we're just going to simply sweep the circle along our path or our line to give ourselves a new skinned surface. And this will give us, once again, a tube. Now, in this particular case, Steve could have done a tube. But this just came down to personal preference. Actually, that was awful too. I got to get this just a little bit cleaner looking. There we go.
But yeah, it just came down to personal preference. We're going to be making use of the circle again, which you'll see in shortly why we're going to be making use of the circle again.
How about we make use of it right now?
Sure.
So if we were to take a very close look at the top of this guy, here he comes up. It's like a tube. It's just opened at the top. If we take that circle that's down there, again, it's not actually positioned at the bottom right here, but if you orientate it right and move it up to the top, we'll now have a cap for this guy. But we're going to make our ladder a little bit nicer. We're going to make it so that the artist can select what the top's going to look like. Is it going to have a flat capped top of the ladder, or we want to have one of those fancy kind that has a sphere at the top?
Exactly, and just my personal preference was to have the ability to switch between that circle and a sphere. There are other ways of going about it had we used a tube rather than a circle, but this was just the way that I chose to go.
Exactly. So we're going to set it up so that we can switch back and forth between rather a sphered top of the ladder or a capped top, and we will be using that circle down here at the bottom that we just swept along the line to begin with to give us the tube shape. We're going to use that up at the top so that we can cap it off. So we'll set that up. Once that's in place, then we can just simply duplicate this guy over, and we have the entire system now sitting over here, positioned properly, just on the opposite side. So all that's left now are our ladder rungs. So remember the line that we created at the very beginning for our pole, the very first thing we did? We're simply going to take this line and branch off in the network, move the line back so that the line is centered between our 2 poles. Keep in mind, this guy just goes right up to there, doesn't go the 1 unit past. And now Steve can resample this line, and the resampling is going to give us nice distributed points that we can copy our rungs to, and he can set up a very simple system that is going to let an artist control the spacing between the rungs.
Yeah.
Once we have that in place, we're going to create a tube and orientate it in the right direction. This is going to act as a ladder rung. And then with a simple copy, we use this line right here as the template in which we're going to copy to. This is the guy we'll be copying. So what happens is we're going to end up getting one of these guys copied to all of our points. Looks like a ladder to me, Steve.
Does to me too. Don't forget the bottom guy.
And yeah, that's just not a bad idea. And then after this, let's see, what else we want to throw in here? Just trying to think. Is there anything
That's actually
else?
everything in this video.
Wow. It just
Should
seems
be
like
real nice and simple.
It just seems like there's so much more. I know there was one more thing I wanted to mention. It escapes me. I guess what I'm getting into mentally is thinking about some of the expressions, and I just, instead of drawing them out here, you're going to explain as you walk your way through them, piece by piece. So with that, let's go ahead and jump over and begin the creation of the ladder for our diving board.
Fantastic. So let's jump back over to Houdini and close out our parameters from before. And let's start by creating a new line that will serve for the pole. And so I'm going to push tab and create a new line sop. Enter and enter to create that. And I'm going to rename this to ladder height template. I'm going to give it a distance of our height parameter up on our asset plus 1. So that's going to come in. If I bring my visibility down here and template our board, it's going to come in just slightly shorter than our board, which is exactly what we were after.
Slightly shorter than our board?
Sorry, slightly longer than
there
the
you
board.
Go. 1 unit longer.
Yes. Wow, I can't believe I said shorter. That's fantastic. So before we start positioning this guy, I do want to create some parameters on our asset that allow us to control the positioning. Yeah. Width of the ladder, the radius of our pole is going to be important in a second, and also an offset that allows us to shift the ladder backwards and forwards in X.
Sounds good.
So I'm going to right click on our ladder asset, come down to type properties, that is off the bottom of the capture region. And let's start creating some new parameters. So I'm going to create a new float up under geometry, which I'm going to call ladder width. I'm just going to lock that at 0.001 and leave it unlocked at 10. I'm going to create another float, which I'm going to call ladder offset. I'll lock that as a minimum of 0 and unlocked around 2. And then I'm going to create a final float for now called ladder radius, and that's going to control the radius of our ladder poles. I'm going to lock that at 0.001 and leave it unlocked at 2. So if we accept that, we've got our new parameters in place, so we can take into account our parameters right now for positioning our pole. So let's deal with positioning our pole in Z first. That's going to be nice and easy. We're going to take our ladder width parameter that we just created, and if we divide that by 2, if we bring up our parameters, you can see as we boost our width out, we've got half of our width on this side, and the other half of our width is going to be on this side. So we take our width and divide it by 2 to get the positioning in Z. We'll boost the ladder radius up slightly as well. That will become apparent in a second. Now to offset back in X, I want to offset back so that we sit flush to the back of the diving board. So that's going to take into account a number of things. It's going to take into account the radius of this circle. It's going to take into account that 0.3 that we use when we offset our board back slightly further than the radius of this circle. Then it's also going to take into account the radius of our pole, our ladder pole, but we also then can add in our ladder offset to allow us to push further back if we wish to. So let's take our origin in X, and I'll do this step by step so we can see it moving. So we can offset by our board pole circle, which if you remember is the circle that's defining this pole. Here's radius X, and that'll move us back flush with that pole. I can take this, let's bring this in an expression editor. I can add to this 0.3, which if we apply is now going to move the line flush with the back of the diving board. We want to take into account the radius of our ladder pole, which if you remember we created our ladder radius parameter. So that's going to offset us back further, but then so we have control over the positioning, we can add in our newly created ladder offset parameter, which if we accept. So now if I bring up the parameters of our asset, we'll see that if we were to change the radius, that's going to affect the positioning, but more importantly, ladder offset allows us to slide that ladder back if we so desire. So I'm now going to set up a circle that we can sweep along this line. So I'm going to push tab, type circle, enter, enter, and I'll rename this to ladder pole circle. I want the type to be a NURBS curve, and I'm going to link radius Y so that it references radius X, and then let's set radius X so it references the ladder radius parameter we've already created up on our asset. So if I bring our visibility down and template this guy, we're going to sweep this circle along this line, again using a sweep swap as we saw in the previous video. So let's create a sweep swap. And we want the circle to go into our first input, the line into our second. Fantastic. And we want to make sure on the output tab that we skin unclosed. So there's our ladder pole. So if we take this circle and we rotate it round and position it onto the top, we can create a flat top cap. So I'm going to branch off of the circle by middle clicking on the output of the circle. I'm wiring this into a transform SOP and enter. With this transform SOP, I want to rotate in X by 90 degrees, and that's going to flip us around to the correct orientation. I want to translate in Y by the length of our line. So let's translate by our ladder height template, which was the line that we created. It has the dist parameter, that's the distance which is setting the length. So that's going to move us up. Let's bring this guy in so we can see as we're slowly positioning this guy. In Z, we're going to want to move to the origin Z of our ladder template line. So let's grab our ladder height template origin Z, which, if you remember, we set that origin Z to our ladder width divided by 2. And then finally we can set X to the origin X of that line. So channel ladder height template origin X. So that's going to position us at the correct height and correct position for our pole. So I will rename this transform to ladder pole cap. And now that we've got this guy, I'm going to merge him in with our sweep mode. So I'm going to right click on the output of the transform, type merge, enter, enter, and wire the sweep in. And let's name this to merge ladder pole. So now that we've got our pole, before I go on and duplicate the pole, let's set up our simple system of switching between a sphere and the flat cap.
Okay.
So to do that, we're going to need a sphere. So I'm going to drop in a sphere SOP. That's not a sphere. There we go. So I'm going to drop in a sphere, and I'm going to name this to ladder pole sphere. I do want to link our radiuses up, or our radii up, so that we follow radius X.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to set radius Y to rad X, and radius Z to rad X. And I'm going to, before we transform our cap into position, if we look at our circle, the circle's centered up around the origin. So is our sphere currently. The rotation that we apply to the circle doesn't have any bearing on our sphere. So if we were to switch before we go through the transform, we don't even need to position this guy. So we'll switch between a circle and a sphere, then transform up to the top of the pole, which is going to transform whichever one we've selected between, which is
perfect.
Perfect, yeah, exactly. So I'm going to wire a switch in between our circle and transform. To do that, because I don't want a switch affecting our sweep, I'm going to right click on the input to our ladder pole cap transform, and I'm going to type switch. The switch is going to work exactly the same as the switch that we saw down in VOPs, where we were switching a texture and a color. In this case, we're just switching between pieces of geometry. So if I bring my visibility to the switch, with the input set to 0, we're taking in our circle. And with the input set to 1, we're taking in our sphere. So now we can create a toggle parameter on our asset that will control this parameter. And we can see when we're set to the circle, to the sphere, that does get positioned correctly. So I'm going to right click on our asset and come down to type properties. And we can create a couple of simple parameters. The first is going to be a toggle that allows us to switch between the sphere and the cap. So let's create a new toggle parameter. And now I'm going to call this end sphere TGL for toggle. And I'll give it the label create end sphere. So when this is turned on, we'll create the end sphere. When it's turned off, we'll get a flat cap. While we're there, let's promote up our radius parameter from the sphere up underneath So let's jump down and grab our ladder pole sphere. Let's promote up its radius x. And we can call this, I'm simply going to give it a label of radius. And you'll see why in a second. And I'll give it the name end sphere radius. As opposed to having this just be a parameter on its own right, I'm going to link it with this toggle in such a way that it's going to have the toggle and then the radius next to it, so we can clearly see that when we create end sphere, we get the ability to access a radius parameter, which logically that's going to tell us, oh, it's the radius of the sphere. To do that, if we come back up to our toggle, we can check horizontally join to next parameter, and if I click apply and bring up the parameters, we can see that we have our checkbox and we have our radius parameter. I'm also going to disable this parameter when we uncheck our checkbox, which is going to grey this guy out so that we can't change him. We can only change him when we're creating a sphere. That's really easy to do. We can come down to the radius parameter in our type properties, and we can enter a simple expression into disable when, such that when the toggle is turned off, we are disabled. So I'm going to open curly brace. When end sphere toggle, which is the name of our toggle parameter, is equal to 0, so when it's turned off, we're going to be disabled. And so if we accept this, I'm just going to apply this because I also want to set up a range on this guy. So let's lock him at 0.001. And to 1. There's a nice range for the sphere. So I'm going to accept this. And now we can bring up, right click on our asset, bring up its parameters. So we have access to the radius of our sphere, and if we uncheck create end sphere, we grey out the radius. That's fantastic. We now need to actually make use of this guy on our switch. To do that, I'm going to come to the switch, and I'm going to set the input to be our toggle. So let's grab our end sphere TGL and bring back up the parameters. So now as we switch between our create end sphere or don't create the end sphere, this guy is activated and deactivated, and our sphere is toggling between a sphere and an end cap.
Very nice.
So we've got one pole. Let's now duplicate this guy to get our second pole. So I'm going to wire our merge into a new transform SOP. By right clicking on the output, I selected transform from the history and enter to create that. And I'm going to rename this to second pole underscore xform. We've already moved over for half of our ladder width, so if we move back in the negative z direction by all of our ladder width, we'll get the correct position. So translate z negative our ladder width parameter. And that will move us over to here. We can now merge these two guys together to have both poles. So I'm going to branch off of this merge by middle clicking. I'll come down to merge from our history, enter to create that merge, and then I'll wire in the second pole. I'm going to name this to merge ladder, and when we create the rungs, we'll merge those into this guy as well. And talking of rungs, that's what we're going to create now. So I'm going to jump up and branch off of our board height template, which, if you recall, is the line we use to sweep that pole. So I'm going to middle click to branch off, and I'm going to wire it into a transform SOP. And let's just bring the transform SOP over to where we're working with the ladder and enter. I'm going to use this transform SOP to position this line for our for our rungs to be copied to. So let's rename this to ladder rung template. And we only need to offset in X since I want this guy to be centered up on our ladder. Let's bring our ladder up as a template. Fantastic. So he's already centered up on the ladder, so we just need to offset in X to the correct location. So to do that, translate X, we can simply take our line that we used to create the pole and take his origin in X, and since we know that that's centered up on the pole, if we translate by that amount, we'll move also to the center of the ladder. So let's grab the ladder height template, which was the line we used to create those poles originally, and let's grab the origin X parameter, and that will, if I bring my visibility down there, offset us over to the center of the ladder. So now it's time to resample this guy, create a number of points along the line. Each point is going to represent a rung because we're going to copy a tube to each point. It's really nice and easy. I'm going to right click on the output of our transform, wire this into a resample SOP, enter to create that. And by default we come in with the ability to specify the length of the segments. I don't want to use a segment length, instead I want to control a number of segments. So we now have control over the number of segments. The number of segments directly corresponds to a number of points, because we're going to have 1 point, well, number of segments plus 1 is going to be the number of points that we have. So let's create a parameter that allows us to control how many rungs we wish to have, and then we can use that to drive this guy. So I'm going to right click on our ladder asset and come down to type properties. I'm going to create an integer parameter in this time, because it would be weird to have 2.5 rungs.
Yeah, for sure.
So I'm going to create an integer parameter, which I will call to num rungs, and give that the name number of rungs. And I'm just going to lock that with a minimum of 2. And yeah, we'll leave that with a maximum of 10. And accept. And I'm going to set the number of segments to be our num rungs parameter minus 1, since if we have 2 rungs we want to have 1 segment. If we have 3 rungs we want 2 segments, because that will give us 3 points, and so on. Set that to 15. So now that we've got those points in place, we can create our tube that we're going to copy to these points. So I'm going to create a new tube SOP. Wow, crazy. Tube, there we go, enter, and enter. I will move these over slightly, there we go. I'm going to rename this to something like rung tube. I have caps lock on, there we go. We want to align this along the z-axis, since that's the direction our rungs are going to be. And I do want to set up a few parameters. The height is going to be the width of our ladder. So let's grab our ladder width parameter. So now you can see the tube runs across the width of our ladder. Our radius, I want to correspond to our ladder radius, so I'm just going to take like a percentage of that. So I'm going to take our ladder radius and multiply it by 0.8. So we're just going to be slightly smaller, which means our rungs are going to sit just inside our ladder. So I'm going to set radius x to be our ladder radius times 0.8, and let's set our second radius to be equal to radius x, radius 1. There we go, cool. So yeah, radius 1 as opposed to radius x. Gets me every time. So we've got the width, well, the length, and also our radius in place. So now we can copy this guy to our points, since we don't need to offset him because our points are in the correct location. So with him being centered up about the origin, when he's copied he'll be centered up about each of these points, which is perfect for what we need. So I'm going to wire our rung tube into a copy SOP. You notice that takes him into a first input, the geometry that we wish to copy. Let's rename him to copy rungs. And I'll take our resampled line into the second input. That's going to give us our rungs on the ladder. Now currently the rungs are going from the very ground up. They're not centered between the top and the bottom of the ladder. We know we created the ladder pole to be 1 unit larger than the line that we've resampled. So if we take that line and translate it up by 0.5, we're going to be centered in between. So let's take this transform that moves our line and translate y on the ladder rung template transform to 0.5, and that would just center us up
very
nicely. I mean, with that, all we now need to worry about doing is wiring this guy into the merge. Bring our visibility down. Let's start just playing around with parameters. I'll for now, wire our ladder into merge all, so that we can
turn our points off as well.
Yeah, cool. So bring up the parameters so we can change our ladder width. Let's change our ladder radius down slightly. Let's bring our sphere down. Much nicer. Let's change our rungs. I think I'll boost the range on that parameter so that we can go up quite high. So let me bring up the type properties for the asset, grab our num rungs, and I'd say 30 is probably a good upper bound. So let's bring up our parameters again. That's much nicer. So cool. I mean, that's everything I wanted to cover in this video.
Outstanding. So in the next video, we're going to be wrapping the ladder up, correct?
Yeah, we are.
We're going to...
Basic shaders. We're going to look at having the ability to switch the diving board on and off.
Okay.
And we're going to set up our floor object as well.
Outstanding. Okay. Well, that is going to conclude this video. Thanks a lot, guys.